The whips have agreed that paragraph 11 of Executive Report number 2, dealing with ward budgets, will be considered next. I have agreed to a request from Councillor Grimston that he be allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes on this item. I call on the Leader of the Council to formally move reception of that report, and I also call on the Councillors Peterkin and Crivelli to move their amendment to the reception motion, which relates to paragraph 11. Councillor Govinda.
Mr. Mayor, I beg to move the reception of report number 2, the report of the Executive.
Mr. Mayor, I beg to move the amendment to paragraph 11, report number 2, which all members have a copy of. All members will have seen this paragraph 11 and possibly read it, but just by way of background to the amendment.
Sorry, can we have a seconder to that, please?
I formally second.
Councillor Peterkin, if you'd like to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As I was saying, the background to this is a personal paper brought by Councillor Grimston to the last Finance and Corporate Resources Overview and Scrutiny Committee, which, in summary, called for that committee to conduct an investigation into ward budgets. The arguments were rehearsed there, but really on 2 grounds I would oppose the conducting of such an investigation. It hasn't actually made it through particularly clearly into the summary, into paragraph 11. But connected to the investigation, it was suggested that there be a budget relating to the investigation, and indeed that officer time be taken up. And I think, and having conversed with members on this side of the House, we don't think that there's a case made out for or justifying use of officer time or budget. Really on 2 grounds. First of all, my view is that
there is nothing in the proposal to devote either budget or time to this officer time to the thing. So, we should be speaking to the paragraph as brought forward, not to some imaginary paragraph that you're inventing.
Councillor Carpenter is actually incorrect there. In the original paper, a budget of, and I quote, perhaps £200 was suggested, and the officer time is implied by the fact that there's a suggestion that we either have the whole committee considering it or a subcommittee of the committee considering ward budgets. As I was saying, I've moved the amendment on 2 grounds. First of all, it seems to me that it fails to answer a proven need. At the very meeting at which Councillor Grimston brought forward his paper, we discussed a number of means that are already available to the Council and to individual councillors in addressing needs that they perceive in their own wards, most notably the new NSIL scheme, which was discussed at length at that meeting. So that's ground 1. On the second ground is that I'm not persuaded of the merits of ward budgets themselves. We were told at that meeting that a councillor in Sutton, which is, I understand, a local authority where such schemes are already up and running, had managed to spend public money on the installation of a totem pole at his own initiative. It may not surprise members to understand that I believe that the member in question was one of those increasingly endangered animals, the Liberal Democrats. But anyway, the fact that the ward budget scheme opens opportunities for such misappropriation of public money gives me some serious doubts about their merits in general. So, on those 2 grounds, firstly, failure to answer a proven need, and secondly, potential for abuse of the scheme, it doesn't seem to me that we can justify expending public time and money on conducting an investigation, and on those grounds, I'd beg to move the amendment.
Thank you, Councillor Peterkin. Councillor Pritchard? Yes, indeed you, and indeed a maiden speech, I believe. Welcome.
First of all, thank you for letting me make my maiden speech. I'm a newly elected councillor for Tooting Ward, And I'd like to talk a bit about ward budgets, and I'm also going to talk a bit about the investigation. I'm just going to ask you the following things. We've heard about the totem pole, but what about a grant to Park Friends for planting bulbs, a grant to a local scout group to go on a special camp, hanging baskets outside tube stations, setting up a time bank, the Canal Heritage Trust, and the Drumnadrochit Piping Society. All of these people have received grants from the ward budgets. They're all local schemes. They're all schemes residents were interested in. The examples come from Hillingdon, they come from Westminster, and they come from Highland. Obviously not all Labour councils. And all of these councils have felt they're able to consider that local people can make decisions on things that matter to them. The funding all came from ward budgets, and these projects themselves are not expensive. A ward budget is normally about £10,000 a year, some places more, some places less. Have the projects made a difference locally? And I think this is the aspect that Councillor Peterkin misses in his amendment, is I'm sure they have. There are a lot of small places, small organisations, where funding makes a huge difference. And also, something I think has been admitted in this debate is can act as seed corn for applying for further grants that local people are able to apply to that councils can't, and therefore increasing our income. I represent Tooting Ward. Tooting's in a part of the borough which actually has the smallest amount of neighbourhood community still. In fact, this year we will not be able to apply for anything. There is nothing. Tooting is a place where the local residents would actually like to improve and develop the infrastructure locally, but there's no money to do so. For example, a local lunch club for the elderly may close due to lack of funds. Local residents want clean streets through better enforcement of litter regulations. And a local primary school desperately wants traffic calming measures outside the school, but this was rejected by the council. If Tooting had its own budget, perhaps local people would vote to have these schemes. Or perhaps they'd have other ideas. But I would say the key point is that local people will be deciding about their money. Councillor Grimston's paper to finance OSC proposes investigating the possibility of ward budgets. I'm going to repeat that, investigating. Councillor Senior's reply was that our resident survey shows Wandsworth does very well on local involvement, and therefore Wandsworth doesn't need to even bother to look at the proposal. I beg to differ. The same resident survey shows a decrease in the percentage of people who feel they can influence council decisions and an increase in the percentage of people who feel they can't. Over 50% of our residents feel they can't influence council decisions. In parallel, the percentage of people who think local decision-making is a good idea has increased. I say there's real interest in local decision-making and ward budgets, and Wandsworth Council should take note. What better way to nurture involvement than by working with a local team on local issues? Councillor Grimston's proposal is to investigate ward budgets, to decide if they work, to investigate, to look at a proposal and weigh up alternatives and take an informed decision. Why does Wandsworth Council find that so difficult? Is Wandsworth a nanny council who knows what's best for its residents without even considering the alternatives? Alternatives that might allow residents greater influence on their lives? I would just say I urge you to vote down the amendment and to support Councillor Grimston's paper in allowing us to investigate properly ward budgets. Thank you.
Councillor Crivelli, again a maiden speech. Thank you.
Mr Mayor, in my maiden speech I must first give thanks to the voters of East Putney Ward who in May decided to give me the opportunity to represent them on Wandsworth Council It's a tremendous privilege to be a councillor for East Putney, and I'm particularly fortunate that I'm ably assisted in my role by two excellent ward colleagues in the shape of Councillor Govindia and Councillor MacDonald. They wrote that line. Mr Mayor, I want to use my maiden speech as an opportunity to support this amendment, as I do not support the implementation of ward budgets, and I feel that they're particularly unsuitable for Wandsworth. I appreciate that Councillor Grimston would be at pains to express that his proposal is only an investigation into whether ward budgets should be implemented. However, I feel to conduct such an investigation into the feasibility of ward budgets for Wandsworth could be seen as unnecessary and also somewhat duplicitous. The suggestion put forward is that ward budgets somehow assist councillors with community engagement. I feel that the advocates of ward budgets may struggle to prove that theory somewhat. Ward budgets don't mean that councillors are more able to represent the residents they serve, and it doesn't mean that the public would have better local services or councillors who are able to raise issues with the council more effectively on behalf of the public that they serve. I dare say that every member of this chamber would agree with me when I say there's more to community engagement than actually giving out grants. Wandsworth is already pursuing community engagement through encouraging residents to serve on school governing bodies, neighbourhood watch forums and through the parent forums for all of our children's centres. We've encouraged resident participation in the development options for projects like the Master Plan in Roehampton and the Winstanley York Road housing estate developments. Furthermore, the Let's Talk forums afford the public an opportunity to feed in directly to councillors their concerns or aspirations about their local area. I did say that an investigation into potential ward budgets could be duplicitous, as the new Wandsworth Grant Fund will bring together the range of grant funds that are available from the council. Crucially, member involvement is enhanced with these proposals, as each organisation making a bid is required to have the support of a ward councillor. This obviously serves to improve the level of connection between the council and its residents that Councillor Grimstone alluded to in his paper. Now, Wandsworth already has operated a variant of the ward budget proposal since 2011 through our Big Society Fund, which has made about 170 awards worth just over £400,000. Now, each project again requires the endorsement and support of at least one ward councillor. Now, bearing in mind all of this, it does appear unnecessary to give any further real in-depth investigation into ward budgets. Now, councillors who advocate ward budgets need to consider the fact that our ward boundaries in Wandsworth don't actually necessarily reflect the local communities, and that distributing grants on a ward basis would mean each ward receiving roughly the same level of funding through ward grants. In effect, wards could be allocated funding by being given a grant budget which it did not require, the reality being councillors being asked to spend money in the ward which wasn't necessarily needed. Now, to support my point in this respect, I hope members will indulge me if I use an unusual example from outside London, where ward budgets have been implemented. I'm going to choose the very unusual example of Great Yarmouth Council. Now, I've chosen this because this was a council that decided to implement ward budgets with a very modest figure of only £2,000 per ward. And there were 39 wards in which the councillors could spend this money. Now, the result being that all councillors of all political colours who didn't spend their ward budgets were publicly pilloried in the local press. Councillor James Tate is quoted as saying, "I wanted to contribute to the War Memorial, but the money wasn't required. I couldn't find anything else that was worthwhile." This is a pattern that was repeated across a number of wards. Councillor Colin Fox was criticised in the local paper for not spending his ward budget. He defended himself, saying, "Nothing came to my attention to allocate the money to, and I wasn't going to spend it for the sake of it. People could say I should have tried hard to spend it, but I wasn't elected to have a little pot of money to spend. It could be better spent if it was collectively pooled." Wandsworth Council already has numerous effective methods for community engagement and the successful distribution of grants throughout our borough. Therefore, I ask members to support the amendment.
Thank you, Councillor Crevelli. Councillor Dr. Alan Khan.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, fellow councillors. I'm Dr. Rosanna Allen Khan, a newly elected councillor in Bedford Ward. In a time of significant national political scepticism, we need to do whatever we can to improve public confidence, mobilise our local voters, and improve voter turnout at the polls. This year, 2014, voter turnout in Wandsworth was amongst the worst in London, with one ward seeing only a voter turnout of 31.8%. In Wandsworth, we have so many things to be proud of, but that statistic is not one of them. Would affordable local ward budgets help this? Perhaps, perhaps not. However, I believe we owe it to ourselves to look at the options at least. While the Council has every right to be proud of its long-standing Let's Talk programme as a means of resident engagement, we could still look at doing more. One of the major public criticisms throughout the local election campaign in my ward, Bedford Ward, was lack of councillor engagement. And even though I'm sure my opposition colleagues were working very hard for the last 4 years, residents criticised lack of visibility, a factor which I believe contributed to the change in councillors this year. Feeling a sense of empowerment in the form of financial influence, however small, would assist with raising confidence within our ward and the whole borough. I understand that we have the Wandsworth Big Society Fund, which is to be applauded for the provision it makes, as well as a new proposal for a grants fund. I do, however, feel that a small pot of money could be beneficial at a ward level for councillors to identify initiatives or groups that would struggle to make applications and would benefit from even a modest amount of money. Examples could include carers group looking to rent a venue for meetings, or some new equipment for a children's centre. I don't believe totem poles would quite make the cut. To refute the launch of an investigation would be non-evidence-based and, dare I say, presumptively arrogant. I'm not necessarily advocating a radical devolutionary approach, merely requesting some research into the matter for purposes of informed decision-making, relying not on speculation alone. This is not an issue of party politics. In Westminster Council, a Conservative council, they have explored this, and local councillors have been granted an annual budget to spend on projects in their ward. This enables councillors to address local issues and priorities that matter most to their residents. This has ranged from improving the local environment with new trees, flowers or paving, funding activity for local residents, a frequently disaffected group of people and voters, and providing new equipment for local sports clubs. Hillingdon is equally a Conservative council who've been successfully giving small ward budgets to their councillors to help local projects. In my ward, Neighbourhood Network is an organisation who have worked hard to identify areas of need in the community and have come up with great ideas, for example, to assist children in our multiple local primary schools for whom English is not their first language. Every ward is different. While centrally we all work hard to consult residents and currently conduct quality impact assessments, one size does not fit all. Socio-demographic variations, social housing, concentrations of religious and cultural groups, sports clubs and parklands are but to name a few. Tonight, I'm appealing for you all not to make a commitment to providing ward budgets, but just to merely consider those communities in your ward who you know deep down could benefit and agree to at least investigate if this may be a good approach for Wandsworth. Thank you very much.
Councillor Caddy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. For me, this debate goes to the heart of how Wandsworth should approach its duties and responsibilities. I totally accept that there's a vital role for government in providing certain services that need to be paid for, and equally, a role in supporting communities to create sustainable organisations and structures to meet their own particular needs. But I do emphatically reject the idea that wards equate even approximately to these communities. I also reject the idea that we have to spend more taxpayers' money to do so. We've already talked about the fact that we administer an excellent grant scheme, recently revised to make it easier to support even more groups. Ward councillors have a strong and expanded role in approving these schemes applying for grants, and we can, as councillors, actively promote and do actively promote the grants to organisations that we think might benefit. And this actually already achieves much of what Councillor Grimston's original paper asks for, without being limited by ward boundaries. So going back to the question of wards, I thought I'd do a quick straw poll before this speech, so I asked several non-political friends what ward they lived in. Most didn't have a clue, one got it right, and quite a few locally to me thought that they knew but got it wrong. And I think this just tells us that wards are a political construct. They don't really reflect how people structure their communities. Times are tight, and we won't rehash the question of why. I think we've probably covered that here a few times already. But the council has had to make enormous savings over the past few years, and we will continue to have to take incredibly difficult decisions in order to balance the budget. I'm not sure that everybody has quite grasped this yet, but surely people can see that for every penny we spend on allocating budgets to wards or neighbourhoods, we need to cut spending somewhere else. That's how a balanced budget works. This means us not allocating money on the basis of need, and we simply can't afford to do that. Another issue is that the holders of these budgets would inevitably, as we've heard, be under pressure to spend them, even if there was no pressing need. Which brings us neatly to why other councils who have introduced such schemes might continue to run them. It seems pretty obvious to assume that if they carry on with the schemes, they must be working, right? Well, I think that's wrong. I think it's evidence that this kind of budget, once given, is incredibly hard to take away. Especially if the budgets are small, the benefit from taking them away will always be outweighed by the incredibly negative public relations effect. I do think spending decisions should be devolved to the most local level possible, as far as possible to the level of the individual. And of course, the best way to do that is to tax people as little as possible so that they can choose exactly what they want to spend their money on. Every single penny that we spend is taxpayers' money. We may get government grants or funding from this source or that source, but ultimately it is taxpayers' money, and we have to bear that in mind every time we approve or commission expenditure by this council. I've always been quite clear about what I want from my council. I want core services delivered safely and efficiently. I want vulnerable people to be properly protected and cared for. And I want the council to support and help community groups who need it. I'd never be complacent, and we can always improve the way that things work. But I believe that Wandsworth does do all three of these things through its business-like, efficient approach to public services, its caring, professional staff, and the variety of ways that it already supports community engagement and community groups, including financially through the grants system. I don't think now is the time to spend precious resources and time on investigating an innovation such as this. So I would ask that you approve this amendment.
Councillor Carpenter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm very pleased to speak in this debate in support of Councillor Grimston's suggestion that the Finance and Corporate Resources Overview and Scrutiny Committee investigate the setting up of ward budgets. Such an investigation does, of course, fall within the competence of the committee, and so if this amendment was approved, its effect would be nugatory. As members know, Councillor Grimston's proposal follows from a paper he presented to the majority group following the May 2014 elections, which showed that the Conservative vote in Wandsworth was in secular decline, and suggesting that one way of addressing that decline was to devolve more decision-making down to ward level and give wards a budget. I therefore find it somewhat surprising that this suggestion has met with opposition from the majority party. They sound rather like turkeys voting for Christmas. The Labour Party has always taken the view, as a democratic socialist party, that the people should decide, not some landed, or in this day and age, hedge-funded gentry. We are therefore very sympathetic to the suggestion of setting up ward budgets, not just from this theoretical viewpoint, but because of the practical benefits we have seen from bringing decision-making closer to the residents affected by the decisions. Within Wandsworth, there are already examples of such devolution. Within the housing revenue budget, some £250,000 annually is devolved to residents' associations to spend through the Small Improvement Grant Scheme. administered through the area housing panels. Individual schemes are put forward by residents' associations, costed by officers, and voted on by the area housing panels. While councillors are present at these panels, they have no vote on the allocations, which are for the residents alone to decide. This programme has over the years produced many worthwhile schemes, like community gardens, new paths and railings, and protective awnings, and helped cement residents' involvement in improving their estates. In my own ward of Roehampton, we already have what effectively is a ward budget. Under this government's Community First programme, we've been allocated some £5,000 per annum for community projects. The money is dispersed through the Roehampton Trust by 6 trustees, including 2 councillors. By levering in matching funding, we have been able to support community activities such as the Lions Football Club, the Roehampton Festival, and older people's cafes. We've even funded some activities that the Big Society Fund has turned down. Although £5,000 doesn't look like a lot of money, it's surprising how many local activities you can support with it. Now, I hear you saying, how are we going to pay for this revolutionary programme? First, it's not a revolutionary programme, but a modest proposal. If we started with a budget of £5,000 per ward, £100,000 for the borough, that's around 1/10,000th of Wandsworth's total budget, less than half a chief executive. But I'm not proposing a judgment of Solomon on the chief executive. I believe that these funds can be found within existing budgets by, for example, top-slicing the neighbourhood element of the community infrastructure levy, or by using some of the secular underspend in the Big Society Fund. I also think it's possible to lever in external contributions in the same way as we do with the Community First programme, which received a £10,000 external donation to extend its life. Mr. Mayor, there have been some quite valid, detailed criticisms, and that's why we want to have an investigation, to tease out the criticism, to work out whether this had to be done on a ward basis or some larger aggregation, and to look at optimising a scheme, if a scheme is to be brought forward. Councillor Grimston has put forward a very modest proposal for ward budgets for investigation. I've illustrated how the benefits of ward budgets can be by leveraging matching funding and promoting community cohesion be multiples of the financial costs. And I've also shown how they could be funded from within existing budgets. I commend Councillor Grimston's proposal for further investigation. Thank you.
Councillor O'Brien, maiden speech.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you for the opportunity to make my maiden speech and on this topic. I'd like to start by saying it's a real privilege for me to be representing St Mary's Park Ward. And in addition to my very hard-working and battling colleagues, Councillor Strickland and Councillor Hampton, I'd like to just acknowledge the great work and service of former councillors Hallmark and Davies in our ward, who served St Mary's Park with great distinction for many years, who are a great example to me and also have been a great support. So I'd like to extend my thanks to them. St Mary's Park is a very busy and exciting ward, as it always has been, really in the heart of Battersea. Riverside development continues apace, and that will set the tone of the area for many years to come. And now, following the end of the fish breeding season, they've done their work. There are plenty of fish in the sea. We will soon have a new river bus pier along the river to add to our heliport. And of course, we have planning permission in place from both sides of the river for our Jubilee Bridge, which is something that within St Mary's Park we are very keen to see sooner rather than later. In terms of local participation and voluntary work, our ward is another great example of what happens in Wandsworth anyway. To pick just 2 examples, many of you will know the work of Battersea Crime Prevention Panel and its sister organisation in the Summer Scheme, raising money for both the young and the elderly in the ward. And also, and for those who don't know, we have within our ward Keys House, which has a very long history in Battersea and in the ward. as a youth centre, which has just opened absolutely fantastic new facility. As I understand, it's the second largest youth centre in Europe, for the benefit of the young across the borough. So I'm very proud to represent the ward and the work that already takes place from our local people in terms of voluntary commitment. And so it's in that context that I come to this particular debate. And you would think perhaps as a new councillor and with no executive responsibility, a backbencher as you will, that I'd be in favour of the proposal, when the contrary is true, and I will very much back the amendment. The arguments have been quite well rehearsed already, so I'll try not to go over old ground, although that's obviously increasingly difficult the further down the speaking order you are. But I'll focus on three issues that I would want to just highlight before we move on towards the final speakers. The first thing that really concerns me about this kind of proposal is the behaviours that it encourages, because the one constituency of people that it really does benefit are actually the ward councillors, rather than necessarily the residents. I fail to see how necessarily giving money to the ward councillor brings decision-making to the residents. If anything, it's got a real risk and danger of introducing a really old-fashioned style of local patronage. This idea of a kind of feudal squire with his sort of pot of money to be giving out to personal interests and other demands for money. So I think there's a real risk of going down that road, and one I think we should really steer very clear of. Also, and this is a key point, it's just the wrong time for us to be considering this, and that's considering either the proposal as a whole or indeed an investigation to it. At a time when some councils who already have the scheme are looking to cut it because they can't afford it, and at a time when we have the greatest responsibility for the hard-earned money of our residents, we have to be, I think, extremely wary of experimental structures which actively encourage the spending of that money. I noted with a wry smile, which didn't speak much for this kind of scheme on two grounds during my research into it, taking up the minutes of a council in the Midlands. There were two recommendations at the top, which said it all for me. The first was to receive the report, which was no great surprise. The second was that councillors be reminded of the existence of the scheme and be encouraged to use the budgets available to them. And for me, that just summed up everything really that is a danger with a ward budget scheme. So it's the wrong time to do it. But I suppose going back to how I opened this as a new councillor in a maiden speech, and I think about why we in St Mary's Park and I have been elected and what we stand for on the Conservative side, there's sort of two guiding principles, and that's value for money and delivering excellent public services. And so, as a guiding principle for anything on budgets, will ward budgets give better value for money? Will they deliver better public services? I'm not convinced on both. I think, if anything, they will add further process costs, administration costs, costs in monitoring, duplication. They add inefficiencies. I'm not sure how really just having a discrete budget, which is then divided up by the number of wards, divided by the number of councillors, and then allocated, actually leads to sensible decision-making of any kind. And for those reasons of value for money, excellent public services not being delivered, the dangers in terms of the behaviours they encourage, and it just being the wrong time at a time of austerity, I would ask people really to back the amendment and to vote down this proposal. Many thanks.
Councillor Grimston.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and I'd like to congratulate all those who have made their maiden speeches so eloquently tonight. I also apologise for the state of my voice. I tried to get some sympathy from my partner as to how I'm feeling, and all he told me was, "You're suffering from man Ebola, shut up." So I apologise for that to start with. Mr Mayor, I have to say, I wasn't sure what to expect coming in tonight in all sorts of ways. It's new territory. I came in with the words of Councillor Senior at the previous OSC ringing in my ears when he told us that the days when the Cabinet member would tell the FCROSC that there was no point in them voting a particular way on a paper because the Executive would not listen and would overturn it were gone, that the new culture in the Council was to listen seriously to what the overview and scrutiny committees would say, to take it on board, to treat them as if they were the old service committees, so we don't need the old service committees with those powers. And I think that the first fence on which that particular horse is running should lead to such a spectacular crash, I think is very, very worrying for the future of this council. As an independent, I hope I'm allowed to follow a line that's actually rather different from most of the debate so far, because this is not Councillor Grimston's paper. This is a decision, a democratic decision by an Overview and Scrutiny Committee of this council by a majority vote. And that is what we're talking about. There are actually some quite big governance issues here. But perhaps the most important is, does scrutiny have any independence whatsoever in this council? Do we have even the pretense that the rules under which it was set up of an equal but opposite counterweight to the power of the executive is now just to be totally revealed as being complete and absolute hogwash? Because when the committee does come to a decision as modest as this, I think it is a fairly modest proposal, but goodness me, Jonathan Swift's modest proposal didn't receive the level of attack that this particular one has done. So I have to say, I've ended up coming in with the hopes that there was this new culture there, feeling really rather sad about an awful lot of the issues here. I think it is sad that I was instructed to withdraw this paper from the Overview and Scrutiny Committee or face the consequences. And frankly, with the amount of that all the 8 boxes, all Irving Janis's 8 boxes on...
what is your point of order?
Point of order.
No, I'm sorry. Unless you want a point of personal explanation. I think it was a point of personal explanation, possibly. But, well,
please continue.
We clearly have a very different memory of that particular discussion. But I think that the instruction to withdraw the paper is one thing. The Councillor Senior should invest so much of his own personal and political capital in trying to get it rejected by the committee. Struck me as being sad. I thought it was sad, some of the discussion we've had here. I mean, goodness me, I do congratulate the maiden speakers, but we're really saying that we shouldn't do this because you just can't trust those wretched councillors in Wandsworth. They're such a bad lot that they will abuse that. For heaven's sake, I would not abuse it, and frankly, I think the quality of councillors in this room is such that I don't think any of my colleagues would abuse it. But if that is the level of argument, you can't afford to trust those. So there's 2 groups of people we can't trust. The people, because if they had freedom over budgets, they would do something very stupid just because they thought it was a sensible thing to do locally, and councillors, because actually the people would get frozen out. Well, goodness me, if that's the reason that we're against a proposal like this, then we ought to really look seriously at whether the quality of councillors, or indeed the quality of the people in Wandsworth, is something that we ought to be overturning. The idea of picking a few random examples of anything going wrong as that, well, frankly, anything that local government does, you can find it going wrong in Great Yarmouth. It is not a great argument to say you've managed to find a few things there. Of course, that's why we need to go out and get there. The idea, we know that we don't need to look at this because after the paper came, we went to go out and look at it. The paradox in that argument, I think, is absolutely screaming. But, Mr. Mayor, can I make a couple of quotes? The one is from a recent peer review of council that also has a difficulty with a rather bullying political culture, where it said the whipping system is the most obvious manifestation of an obsession with hierarchy and control. At a time when there is desperate need to embrace diverse ideas, consider alternatives and be willing to change direction, party leaders crush dissent within their own groups. It is hardly surprising that there are such low levels of engagement with local people when it's difficult to embrace an idea from the other side of the chamber or even from your own backbenches. At a time when openness is crucial, it is still compliance that is valued. It's striking that the challengers to the 3 big parties, UKIP and the Greens, are embracing the idea of working without whipping. Barracking and talking over others are behaviours which also damage the council's reputation. And yet we are seeing develop a culture which actually trains councillors with just 6 months experience that it is okay, actually it's encouraged, that they should catcall and abuse colleagues with several decades of experience when they try to explain why they've taken a different view on things. The other quote is this: as soon as the localism bill allows, I want to kick off an early debate on whether the cabinet model is serving the council well. At present, much of the political leadership rests with the Cabinet. The scope of delegation is limited and dependent on the individual Cabinet member. There is a widespread feeling among members that the real decisions are made in the leaders' group and all the other processes that follow are secondary. I wholeheartedly agree with the leader when he made those comments three and a half years ago. I wonder whether what is happening around this issue is a very good example of how he wanted to see that culture develop. But, Mr. Mayor, saddest of all, I have to say...
I think, yes, Councillor Govindia would like a point of...
I think Councillor Grimston is quoting from a speech I made at the hustings that led to my election as this group's leader. And clearly it was in reference to the kind of debate that we had. And I think he's wrong to say that I have not lived up to it.
I apologise then. I will let members reach their own decisions on that. Mr. Mayor, just to conclude though, I think, you know, of course, I recognise that around budget issues, around their party discipline and coming to a common view is necessary to deliver a view. And of course, as the majority continues to fall and as we return in a council where basically speaking the colour of this council will be the opposite colour from the government of the day, then those votes are likely to be such that whichever party happens to be in power at a particular time, whipping around the budget is important. And I do recognise that, of course. But this was simply about going out and asking a few questions. Goodness me, that £200 budget I mentioned, which I did, it's quite right, was about offering travel expenses to people who might take the trouble to come into this town hall and talk to us about their experience. I wasn't even proposing that members of the task group should charge their own expenses when they went out elsewhere. And goodness me, if we really are saying that we are so confident that we know absolutely everything out there that's going on, that we can ignore the experience, say, of Barry Taylor in Queenstown Ward, who levered in the ward budget there by forming matched funding projects with the local businesses and ended up with well over £100,000 coming into his local community on a sustainable basis. So when Westminster did reduce the budget, that funding was still there and is still being spent for local people. And goodness me, I think for us to say straight away, no, none of this. I mean, the idea that Wandsworth is the only council in the world where wards don't fit a natural community boundaries. With district councils out there where you could fit the whole of Wandsworth geographically into a single district council ward. You think they might have issues about the community in different parts of the community. Many of those think that ward budgets are worth dealing. Why don't we go out and find how they manage that, whether they look at cross-ward budgets or area budgets or whatever. But the idea that this level of paranoia, that we can't even go out and discuss things anymore, we can't even go out and get information to take our decisions, but most important of all, that we cannot respect the decision of one of our overview and scrutiny committees, that we will use the power of the whip in this chamber to overtake it, might work when there are massive majorities coming every time. I can say to my former colleagues and indeed current colleagues as councillors here, that is the way that organisations collapse. The generals, as they enjoyed their triumphs in Rome, would pay a slave to say respice post te, hominem te esse memento. I think those words should be listened to today, 2,000 years later on, because I think they have the same power. When Rome started to collapse, the emperors stopped paying slaves to whisper in their ears, look behind you, remember that you are mortal. They started to describe themselves as gods. And Mr. Mayor, I know there are many in the majority party that are as worried as I have increasingly been about this, that see this political culture turning into an elective dictatorship which has no room, not only for alternative views, but even for people who want to go out and find whether there might be alternative ways of doing things out there. But Mr. Mayor, I think this is actually quite an important vote tonight, because the way this vote goes will show us whether in the next 3 years the leadership of this council is going to resemble Pompey or whether it's going to resemble Caligula.
Councillor Senior.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can I start again by congratulating those who are making their maiden speeches tonight. I hope we will continue to get speeches, albeit of different views of the same quality, in the next 3.5 years to come. I've been around a little bit longer than that, but I was reminded only on Monday night that this week sees the 25th anniversary of Councillor Tracy being elected to the council. But since I've been elected, one thing struck me when I was elected, and it struck me ever since, in the way in which we do business on this council is that we get on and we do the job. Yes, we talk in acronyms a lot of the time, but we don't tend to talk in management speak. We don't boost hoteliers' profits by having away days, and normally speaking, we don't sit around saying, if the council were a car, would it be a Ford or a Mercedes? We actually get on and do the job, and we do so with approval ratings that are consistently some of the highest in London and indeed in the country as a whole. And we do so as well, as has been reflected earlier on, by levying a rate of council tax, which is one of the lowest in the country in addition. So that's my first sort of intrinsic problem with this inquiry, is that I fear this will become nothing other than a waffle fest, where a group of self-appointed experts are brought in to talk about the subject, no doubt for quite a long time, at the end of which to produce recommendations, which I'm sure will almost certainly be in favour of ward budgets, because that's the sort of expert that will no doubt come in and say what a good idea they are. But as we've heard earlier on, quite rightly, not only wards are artificial constructs, and there will always be a pressure to spend whatever monies are allocated on this sort of scheme, whatever the need may be. In fact, is there really a need for a scheme of this sort? Is there really a need for us to spend our time and trouble investigating it? We've already heard tonight about all the other things which the council is doing. Councillor Carpenter rightly pointed out the money that the housing department gives out. We've got another item on the agenda later on this evening to look at new ways in which we are dealing with our own grants projects. We've already had an extremely successful non-wards-based grants project overseen by a committee of councillors to ensure that the money is spent in the right way. We're now looking forward to expanding that system further, to giving more political control on some grants which have been a little bit underneath the radar and of which more of us are aware. We've got huge challenges over the next few years, enormous financial challenges in view of the way in which the government is continuing to cut our grants. We've got other challenges to continue to provide good and decent services for our neighbours. Let us stop scheming these schemes and get on with the job instead.
Right. Well, the matter now before the Council is the amendment proposed by Councillor Peterkin and seconded by Councillor Crivelli concerning the proposed investigation into ward budgets and forums. So please indicate by show of hands those for the amendment. Right. And those against the amendment? Any abstention? Those abstaining? Those abstaining? Right. The amendment is carried 32-20. So, therefore, the amendment is carried. Right. Now, the second motion, or the motion rather, before the Council, is the receipt of paragraph 11 of report number 2 concerning ward budgets and forums, with the amendment approved by the Council.
Ask if you can agree on the same numbers.
Can we go by the same numbers? Agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but I just wondered if I could ask for a point of explanation, which wasn't covered by any of the subsequent speakers. It's something that Councillor Carpenter referred to and also Councillor Grimston, because the paragraph was agreed at the committee meeting, and obviously I understand that we've just taken an amendment this evening, but what is the status of a paragraph that has been agreed at that committee? I understand it was agreed by 6 votes to 5. Is it not something that's then within the purview of that committee and then still stands, which was effectively what Councillor Carpenter was saying? Just appreciate your explanation. Thank you.
Point of order, Mr. Mayor. Would it be appropriate to ask how much that legal advice cost, and perhaps compare it to the sum of £200, which was the alternative way that?
Sorry, under what standing order are you raising that point of order?
I suspect it must be. Okay, in that case, Mr. Mayor, I'd like to.
Thank you for the point.
I'd like to propose an adjournment of the Council to discuss that particular question.
Do you have a seconder?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to propose the adjournment of the Council for a period of 30 seconds, just to discuss this particular issue. We've just had a great deal of emphasis being placed by the proposer of the amendment and indeed by the Cabinet member and by other speakers as to the importance of the funds here and how £200 spent, if it would be that much, that was only a figure, I can't imagine it would be that much, but money which might be spent on the inviting people who might come here, not as Councillor Senior said, experts. I had the idea that we'd actually talk to fellow councillors in other councils that do this scheme. And we would indeed look for those who do it well and those who wish they'd never touched the wretched thing. Because I'm not actually advocating. I think ward budgets might have something there, but the point of this was not to advocate it. It was to go out there on a rather more systematic note than a few randomly put together anecdotes after the decision had already been taken, but actually to do it more consistently. And the argument that was put by the proposer of the amendment and indeed by other speakers was that a main reason for not doing this was that it had a budgetary implication of £200 and officer time. Now, we have just been told that legal advice was sought on this. My experience of legal advice is that sometimes it can cost even more than a few bus passes for councillors in councils like Hillingdon or Westminster or Kensington and Chelsea to make their way down to the town hall here. Indeed, I'm told it can cost very considerably greater sums like that. And the problem is that my feeling of this whole debate is that the level of the discussions just is not consistent with what we've actually been discussing, which was a few councillors, a small task and finish group made up of members of FCROSC or others, going out and talking to a few other councillors just to get the idea about things. The level of discussion here. Now, if it is indeed the case that legal advice has been sought, as you've just told us, Mr. Mayor, then I think it's absolutely crucial in coming to a view as to whether those arguments were honestly made or whether there was something far more sinister going on here, as to whether that some of the amounts of money being involved were actually commensurate. Because if that legal advice and the officer time was anything compared to what we're talking about, then clearly the argument that this was about finance has been made on an extremely unsound basis that the neutral observer might feel was maybe not particularly connected with reality.
Councillor Senior, will you respond, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I will respond to that. The answer to Councillor Grimston's question is zero. The time concerned was officer time by Mr. Walker and his colleagues. I am sure that the time spent will be far less than the time spent would have been spent if we'd wished to continue along the lines of the inquiry proposed. We've now been discussing this issue for nearly an hour, and I think it shows what a small and frankly an important issue it is compared to some of the very important issues on the rest of our agenda, so I suggest that Councillor Grimston's motion be rejected.
The motion now before the Council is that the Council adjourns for a period of 30 seconds to discuss the Council's debate on ward budgets and forums. So those in favour? And those against?
So that's lost 1933. 1933.
33. The adjournment motion is lost 19 to 33. We therefore move on to next business.